In 1926, more than 1.6 million striking workers brought Britain grinding to a halt. It was the first and only general strike in British history and remains one of the defining moments in the labour movement. 100 years on, our next issue of New Internationalist marks its legacy and global significance, exploring how the events continue to shape debates about workers' power, democracy, and the right to strike today. With workers' rights and trade unions under attack around the world, it's more important than ever to revisit the lessons of 1926 and the enduring power of collective action. Subscribe today via the link in our show notes to read this issue in full.
Here's a simple idea. Big rooftops should have solar. Across the UK, there are thousands of large buildings with empty roofs that could be generating clean electricity right now. Instead of waiting for government or big energy companies to get on with it, Big Solar decided to do it themselves. Big Solar Co-op is a not-for-profit cooperative owned by its members, installing solar on big rooftops across Britain. Join and invest from £100 at bigsolar.coop. Capital at risk, please read their online share offer document for details.
The old world is crumbling and is dying, and in its place, this is a chance to create something so much better.
Welcome to The World Unspun. I'm your host, Maxine Betteridge-Mose. Regular readers of New Internationalist magazine will be familiar with our column Temperature Check. Written by longtime contributor and former co-editor Danny Chivers, it's a climate and environment-focused column that highlights climate wins and solutions-focused movements from all around the world. Recent editions have touched on something called the Fossil Fuel Treaty, which is an initiative that aims to build an international agreement to halt new fossil fuel developments and commit to a phase-out of existing oil, coal, and gas production in a fair and just way. So far, 18 national governments have endorsed the treaty, which is being led by small island states and other countries in the global south. To learn more about this initiative and its huge potential for our planet, I spoke to one of its key campaigners.
My name is Tori Tsui, and I am a climate justice campaigner and author based in the UK. I am a senior advisor for the Fossil Fuel Treaty and also an expert advisor for Brian Eno's Earth Percent.
Tori is an impressive woman, and she's behind so many incredible initiatives in the climate space right now, the Fossil Fuel Treaty being just one of them. Over the course of our conversation, we also talked about why the climate movement is stronger when linked to anti-war movements and Palestine solidarity movements.
I think that it's a really important thing for each and every person who says that they advocate for a fair future, a livable climate, should be talking about Palestine.
As well as the often hidden abuse and harassment that women climate activists in particular face while doing this work.
Every single one of us has dealt with torrents of abuse and been hurled misogynistic abuse over the last few years for the activism that we do, and I definitely see that having increased.
Stay tuned. We've written about the Fossil Fuel Treaty in the past in the magazine, and I think it's something that still remains not as known as it should be, and it's quite an inspiring initiative that more people should know about and get involved with. What is the Fossil Fuel Treaty, and how did you get involved in it?
So the Fossil Fuel Treaty is what I see as a missing piece in global climate governments. It's a binding framework to stop the expansion and manage a fair phase-out and accelerate just transition away from fossil fuels. And I initially started getting involved with the treaty back when I met the president of it, Tzipora Berman, in Edinburgh for a conference called TED Countdown. And I had just finished doing an activation with some comrades to challenge the CEO of Shell, who had been platformed at this conference. And I met Tzipora there and was really encouraged by what the treaty stood for. And I started doing some champion work with them. So I was just promoting the treaty in different spaces. And then 2 years ago, I got offered a job to work with them as a senior advisor, kind of overseeing a lot of their strategy around comms and champions work. And yeah, that journey has been incredible and has taken me to, the G20 in Brazil, to on stage at a Massive Attack concert. So it's not a typical job, and it's a pretty incredible way to advocate for what I have mentioned, like a missing piece in global climate governance.
Mhm. And many people will be familiar with the UN COP summits as sort of a big kind of mainstream climate action framework. But can you sort of tell us a bit more about what you mean by missing piece? Why are those UN COP summits not enough on their own? And what is the gap that the treaty fills?
Yeah, so I think the way that we try to frame it at the Fossil Fuel Treaty is that we're a complementary agreement to the Paris Agreement. So for those who may need reminding, the UNFCCC, our climate framework, produced the Paris Agreement, which is this global framework to get us to not surpass 1.5 degrees of warming. It's a legally binding framework that many countries from around the world have signed. We have unfortunately lost a few countries along the way, but it stood as this really, really incredible landmark piece of framework to galvanize people behind reducing carbon emissions. However, fossil fuels are kind of the heart of this issue, the crux of why we're witnessing so much climate degradation, increased, militarism, increased, profiteering from big companies. And yet somehow its words were not even mentioned in the Paris Agreement. And that basically provides a loophole for nation states to avoid climate culpability, especially those who are the biggest polluters and the most historically long-term polluters when it comes to carbon emissions. And the treaty is essentially a way to fill that gap, as I mentioned, that missing piece. And it's a way of holding those countries accountable, plus providing a framework to make sure that this is a just transition, because at the heart of this is climate justice, this understanding that the climate crisis was not created equally and the impacts of it will not be felt equally either. And I think that's what's so remarkable about the Fossil Fuel Treaty is that it really gets to the crux of the matter. It really focuses on the key culprits, which are fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas. And at the heart of it all is this lens and this narrative around justice.
And can you talk a bit more about who these countries are? I mean, I understand it's very much led by the global South nations, small nations in the Caribbean as well as South America. But who sort of makes up the treaty at the moment, and what are some of the big players, and who else should really be on board with it?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, it is largely spearheaded by countries in the global South and specifically small island nations. And it really builds off a lot of the momentum and a lot of the work that has been done around nuclear non-proliferation, which was also largely spearheaded by Pacific Island states. So you have your low-lying island nations, which are most prone to the impacts of climate change, that are suffering the gravest impacts of it. And they're the ones who are really pushing for this treaty. Now, alongside that, we also have larger countries, typically coal-producing countries like Colombia from the global South, having signed and endorsed the treaty, which is a huge, huge win for the global climate movement, and also sends a very strong and clear message that even some of the biggest polluters from the global South want to take responsibility and want to be at the forefront of this change. And we also have, other island nations who have endorsed from the Caribbean as well. And I think we're just below 20 nation states who have endorsed, and that number is only growing. But there is a really clear stipulation within the treaty that we want this to be global South-led and focused, because I think there has been such a emphasis before on global North leadership. And in my honest opinion, and probably in the opinion of a lot of colleagues and comrades in the climate movement, that's not really served us well. Because it is always those who are most vulnerable who, when they're protected and when they're uplifted and when they set the level of justice that is deserved, that everyone benefits.
And you mentioned Colombia, and I want to talk a bit more about Colombia specifically because, like you said, it's a really big deal that they've signed on to the treaty. Many people will know as well that Colombia is a founding member of the Hague Group, which is a coalition of non-Western, primarily global South countries, to enforce international law against Israel. So I think Colombia is having like a real moment, it seems, and is really sort of leading a lot of these amazing initiatives. Can you talk a bit more about why now? Why are we seeing more countries in the global South taking this lead, and what sort of lesson should that be for the global North?
Yeah, I think, to talk about Colombia, it being the first fossil fuel producing country to endorse the treaty is a huge win, and it breaks a major political barrier. And I think the reason why this is the case is that it proves that a transition is possible from within fossil fuel dependent economies and not just outside of them. And when you have a country like Colombia endorsing a treaty, it just paves the way for other countries to step up and to show leadership. And you ask why now? I think we're really at a turning point. We have a leftist government in Colombia that has made some bolder commitments to climate action. We're seeing increased militarism. We're seeing, swathes of issues unfolding as a result of cost of living. And these are the countries that, while they may be fossil fuel producing, are also bearing the brunt of Western imperialism, bearing the brunt of Western inequality, and also a lot of the decisions that are being made out of the core of the empire, right? And so I feel as though having a country like Colombia endorse is really creating this sense of credibility, urgency, and moral authority that we need. And I think that coming from the countries that have had to deal with the brunt of so many issues at the hands of the West is a really clear signification that enough is enough and that they won't stand for this anymore. And I think something that is really imperative to think about when it comes to the treaty is we don't see it as charity. We see it as an obligation. Like, a just transition is an obligation, and we need to ensure that polluters and wealthy nations fund this transition globally. And we want global South countries to be at the forefront of spearheading those changes, because they are the ones who require that obligation. They are not asking for charity, they're requiring for justice to be served.
And you mentioned increased militarism, and people will be well aware of the climate impacts of the ongoing genocide in Gaza, as well as the war on Iran. Obviously, today I was reading Europe has like 6 weeks left of oil supply as a result of the Strait of Hormuz being blocked. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the links you see between the climate justice movement and the anti-war movement and the anti-militarism movement, and like how are those interlinked in not just fighting for a greener planet, but also an end to the genocide, an end to militarism, like all of these different things. I'm wondering how you sort of see them fitting together.
Yeah, I think at its most basic level, if we're going to talk about the sort of typical way of climate advocacy, carbon parts per million, the military is the single biggest industrial carbon emitter that exists. And I think that when we negate that in not only political discussions, but in our discourse, we're really missing a very big piece of the puzzle. And I think when we talk about climate justice, we obviously understand that climate change is not just as a result of these carbon emissions that are being released as a result of burning fossil fuels. It's also due to extractive hierarchical systems that are rooted in deep political inequality and come from legacies around colonialism and imperialism and extractivism, and are very much based on the social injustices that govern this world. And I find that a lot of the narratives over the last couple of years have really tried to push for that, to really understand that, say, for instance, like with the genocide that's happening in Palestine, this is a humanitarian issue. This is a matter of social injustice. And by virtue of that, it is therefore something that we as a climate justice movement should care about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I guess to bring it back to the UK, where you and I both live at the moment, I know you were deeply involved in the Stop Rosebank campaign, which made it really difficult for new fossil fuel extraction in the UK. I'm wondering now, the Labour government has also pledged to halt new oil and gas licenses. Do you see this as being a potential moment for this particular Labour government or future governments in the UK to sign on to the fossil fuel treaty? Do you see it following, the leadership of other countries? And what sort of pressure should the public take to make sure that this is something that the UK should be a part of?
Yeah, it's really interesting that you mention North Sea oil and gas, because very recently Trump decided to release a tweet saying that the North Sea oil and gas should be drilled and extracted, drill baby drill, as he says, which, he's decided to have a say in what we do over here. And Rosebank was such a phenomenal case, as with Stop Cambo and Stop Jackdaw campaigns that were led by the same coalition. because it was really testing and undermining all of these narratives that were spewed out by the previous Conservative government, that this was going to boost energy security and that it was vital for the UK's economy. And a lot of researchers within the coalition denounced that and were like, no, actually, the majority of this oil and gas will be exported overseas and will not actually bolster UK energy security at all. And I think that, the Labour government kind of being part of that change was very momentous. I obviously have my own opinions about the Labour government and where they're failing us in other ways, specifically with the genocide in Palestine and the leadership that Keir Starmer has kind of imparted on this country. But in the case of, the Labour government and the UK more broadly endorsing the treaty, I have to say, I think the majority of what the treaty focuses on at the moment on a nationwide level is to get global South countries to be the ones driving the change. Because I think what happens when you have countries like the UK, long-term historical carbon emitters, endorsing frameworks such as this, is there is a very big risk that they undermine the credibility of this movement, because there's a lot of talk and there's not enough do. And the UK is not living up to their climate commitments. They're failing them. And while we have sort of regional and citywide endorsements from around the UK, which have a lot of momentum and are politically significant, I think having large global South countries really driving the change and setting the standard is a lot more impactful than having your biggest polluters endorsing it when they're not actually ready to make those commitments.
Thanks to our global network of contributors, New Internationalist is able to cover stories that mainstream media often ignores, platform alternative perspectives, and highlight voices from the global South. With more than 50 years at the forefront of independent media, we've earned a reputation for intelligent, progressive journalism that gives a human face to the news. To learn more and subscribe, visit the link in our show notes, subscribe.newint.org.
I think, it's very easy when we're talking about these sort of high-level government treaties and, who's signing on and who isn't, that gets sort of removed from the human experience and how people really understand climate justice and climate action. But I'm wondering if you can explain, what could the world look like and what is sort of the vision if more states do sign on to this treaty, and how might that sort of impact people's day-to-day life?
Yeah. Well, if we kind of start with the converse, I think it goes without saying that continuing fossil fuel expansion effectively locks in more conflict, more economic volatility, and climate disaster, and they all feed back amongst each other to create this like perpetual loop. And that risks a lot for us as humanity, as collectives, whereas transitioning to renewables is not a burden, but actually a defining economic opportunity. So we're talking about jobs, we're talking about innovation, stability, and energy independence. And as we're seeing at the moment with the Strait of Hormuz in the conflict that's happening in Iran, the world has come to a standstill. And yet we have these resources that are abundant, that are plentiful, that we wouldn't have to rely on a certain strait to transport. And that could give so many countries so much economic and political freedom. And at the moment, we're currently in this gridlock, as you mentioned, like 6 weeks worth of fuel. The knock-on effects of that, sure, these industries and the people who are behind them are going to suffer, but actually the people who are going to suffer the most are those who are just trying to put food on their table. We're going to look at like rising food costs and energy bills, and that's going to hit the poorest hardest. And so, with the likes of the Fossil Fuel Treaty and other initiatives that are trying to move us away from what we see at the treaty as weapons of mass destruction is only going to be beneficial. Who doesn't want cleaner air? Who doesn't want more affordable housing and healthcare? Who doesn't want more job opportunities? Who doesn't want a future grounded in equality and longevity? I think it's a bit of a no-brainer, but when you have an industry like the fossil fuel industry, which has such a political and economic foothold on the power structures of the world, and its infrastructure is so embedded, it's going to be a hard fight. It's going to be a hard battle, but I do think that the public conscience is shifting, and I think part of that is to do with the fact that we are just witnessing sheer violence unfold across the globe, and those decisions are not being enacted by us. They're being enacted by certain countries, certain people, and people have had enough of it. And I actually think, if I may speak about, say, like the Green Party here in the UK gaining so much momentum, the Greens were always known for their climate policy and their climate stance, but their communication strategy over the last couple of months has not been focused on just the climate. In fact, that would be something that would, I think, actually not serve them. It's been focused on equality, on setting the record straight and getting things, getting us on the right path. And I think that's a really powerful way to actually advocate for the climate, because when you manage to create a more socially just society, climate is obviously the heart of that, but it doesn't need to be the way that we frame it. So it's a very exciting time in the UK in that regard. But I do sense a huge amount of fatigue and disillusionment amongst the masses about where certain countries and leaders are taking us.
Mm-hmm. And I want to come back to that, because I know this idea of, disillusionment and climate anxiety is something that you've written about a lot, and
Sure.
is more important than ever. But just before we get into that, I know there's a summit coming up in Colombia later this month in Santa Marta, which is the first in a series of bringing together various kind of civil society groups, governments, NGOs, frontline communities. And I'm wondering if you can talk about what this series is and sort of what the hopes are.
Yeah. What's happening in Santa Marta is incredible. It is a historic shift. After decades focused on emissions and global climate politics, we're finally confronting the root cause, which is fossil fuels. And this is a coalition between the Colombian and the Dutch government, being supported by the Fossil Fuel Treaty. So it's not inherently a fossil fuel treaty event, but we are providing the framework to hopefully guide us towards a just transition. And it's such an exciting opportunity, because it really is getting to the crux of the matter, as I've said, but it's also, as we've kind of alluded to before, really centering like global South countries in this decision-making, in this fight.
Yeah, as you've sort of explained, and as we're seeing, there's so much to be worried about, and there's so much wrong with the world, but there are so many things happening as well. So bringing it back then, I guess, to some of the dread that people are feeling, understandably, in the state of the world right now, something that I've certainly felt myself. What is some of the advice that you give to people around dealing with eco-anxiety? And can you talk a bit about your own experience with eco-anxiety and how it's changed over the years?
Yeah, I wrote a book that came out a few years ago, which was all about navigating eco-anxiety and the climate crisis, but it was kind of a deep dive into the sort of frameworks that have given rise to it. I see it as merely a symptom of the world that we're living in, and really talk a lot about neoliberal capitalism and the structures that prop that up, which have given rise to a lot of mental health struggles in the world. And so my perspective on it is very much a reflection, sure, of what's happening with climate change, but also these other social and political injustices that we've touched on in this episode. And I think that so much of the struggle that we experience has been pathologized and individualized by mainstream society. And that's also reflected in the mechanisms with which we're given to cope with these things. There's a lot of individualized so-called solutions, which aren't actually solutions, but actually just prolong the problem itself. And so I make a case and an argument that actually when we're talking about these sorts of issues, one of the best things that we can do is organize, because that really is getting to the heart of what's creating this dysfunction, this lack of wellness. And I argue that taking down the fossil fuel industry is mental health care, for instance. That's more of a long-term way of thinking about it, but I don't want to negate the things that we can do in our everyday life that reroute us back to ourselves and our communities and create that semblance of belonging and and dignity and safety. But I do talk about political organizing as like a commitment to dismantling these structures that are inherently making us unwell. So that's one element of it. And I think linked to that is this really innocuous / intangible concept of community. And I think that there are so many different ways to build community. And in a world that tries to isolate us and individualize us, rerouting ourselves back towards one another, whether that be through mutual aid and forms of community care, is one of the most radical things that you can do. And it's something that I've really felt the impacts of personally. I'm someone who has struggled with my mental health a lot in my life, and have experienced a plethora of different complex traumas and experiences that have really informed the way that I navigate the world. And I've found that one of the best salves and balms for something like this is community care. It has really healed me in so many ways, and having that interdependence with people is a really beautiful thing. But then it's also something you take into your organizing, because when I know that I'm not resourced enough to continue doing the work, that someone else will step in. And it's just this sort of like effort that we all put in when someone needs to take a step back. It's like this mycelial network of channeling all of these resources.
There's something else I wanted to ask you too, which is around young female climate activists in particular. The big names, someone like Greta Thunberg, who when she was a lot younger was just campaigning in a way that was just linked to the climate. And I think we've talked a lot around the importance of movement building across anti-war movements, climate movements. But at the same time, I think women in particular have faced pushback for being more outspoken, not just of, staying within their lane of climate activism, but speaking out on so many other things. Is that something that you've noticed in your work, and how have you sort of adapted to that, I guess, as you've gotten older?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I don't think I can necessarily speak to the specificities of every single woman in the climate movement, but I think I can broadly say that every single one of us has dealt with torrents of abuse and been hurled misogynistic abuse over the last few years for the activism that we do. And I definitely see that having increased, especially with the rise of authoritarianism and the different sort of factions of people and where they stand on the genocide. I think being very vocal about it, specifically online, subjects you to that level of abuse. And I don't think people really understand the sort of mental and physical toll it takes to be public facing and to talk about these things. It's a barrage of exhaustion and violence that you see. And I think it reaffirms the traumas that we're trying to dismantle as well. The reality of living in a time such as now is that our freedoms aren't guaranteed. And I think we as a society have become complacent with this idea that once we've fought for rights of any given nature, that they're just locked in. But as we're seeing, they're not. There's so much regression happening, specifically coming out of this country and also places like the United States. And when you are increasingly visible in a time where these rights are being stripped back, the nature of it is that you're going to deal with more abuse. And yeah, in my case, I think there's only so much that you can subject yourself to before you kind of actually have to take a step back. And I've had moments of stepping forward and stepping back over the last few years, and really prioritizing my mental health has been of utmost importance. And yeah, it is really scary out there at the moment. And I do feel very deeply for people who have much larger platforms and far fewer liberties than me, because there is no respite. And that really does take a toll on your well-being. Something that I like to leave with people who are listening, who might be feeling this level of despair, who might be feeling sheer frustration about what we're seeing, is that I really, really want to maintain that the old world is crumbling and is dying. And in its place, this is a chance to create something so much better. And I think frameworks like the treaty and other values that are being championed by different movements really fill that void. And are going to pave the way for a more equitable future.
That was Tori Tsui. You can follow her work, as well as the work of the Fossil Fuel Treaty more broadly, on Instagram. We've linked their accounts in the show notes. You can also find more on everything you heard in today's episodes via the link in our show notes. And while you're there, please be sure to subscribe to New Internationalist magazine. It's the single best way to support our journalism. You can use the discount code TheWorldUnspun for 20% off your first year of a print and/or digital subscription. This episode was hosted and produced by me, Maxine Betteridge-Mose. I'm the digital editor at New Internationalist. My co-editors are Amy Hall, Conrad Landon, Decca Muldowney, Nick Dowson, and Bethany Riley. Our theme music has been produced by Samuel Raphael Williams, and our logo design is by Mari Foos. Audio editing is by Nasik Hamza. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll be back soon.